there's a good story to tell in the American story, and that's all civilizations ultimately are, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And the only legitimate story you're allowed to tell right now is this really nasty story about America. And I think that is the suicidal path. If I had to sort of pick a villain in all of this, which I don't want to do, but I would say that, the sort of Howard Zinn version of America, Howard Zinn's People's History of America is still the number one, I believe the number one history text in America in high school and colleges. And he's very explicit about this. I mean, you give him points for honesty. He basically says, he only cares about history from the perspective of the victims, whether it's this Indian tribe or the Irish in this coal mine, coal industry era, or whether it's African Americans or it's Latinos. His is a social history of the victims. And I have zero problem telling that part of the story. And that, in fact, I want those stories to be told. Mm-hmm. What I have a problem with is this idea that those are the only legitimate stories to tell, right? The analogy I keep coming back to is, remember the movie Goldfinger, the James Bond movie, right? Yeah. Okay, so in Goldfinger doesn't actually try to rob Fort Knox. What he tries to do is irradiate all of the gold in Fort Knox so that it can't be used for like 10,000 years, taking it off the market, making his second largest stockpile infinitely more valuable. What I take objection to is, forget identity politics for a second.
I have not yet guessed the other half of this analogy, so do go ahead.
Sure, is that so much of the sort of the sort of new class intellectuals, the sort of the priestly class, as Schumpeter would put it, they only care about irradiating. They want to irradiate all the usable gold from our history and say it is invalid and unusable in our political discourse, right? And so, going back to Charles Beard, the founding can only be understood as rich white men trying to protect their property rights, right? All these notions about, you find on, all of these idiot controversies you find and hyped on college campuses, which I'm sure I'm at least that you're at least a little weary of hearing about as well. It's always this stuff about how even the concept of free speech is about entrenched white power and white privilege and all these kinds of things. Our notions of liberal democratic capitalism are enmeshed in white supremacy and cannot be, separated from it. That the history of America is simply a history of genocide, oppression, bigotry, and woe. And that is nonsense, first of all. Are there those stories in our history? Absolutely. Should we teach those things? Absolutely. Shouldn't we also teach that, this country spilt an enormous amount of blood and treasure getting rid of slavery, getting rid of inherited titles of nobility, there's a good story to tell in the American story, and that's all civilizations ultimately are, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And the only legitimate story you're allowed to tell right now is this really nasty story about America. And I think that is the suicidal path. And so identity politics fits into that, because to the extent that identity politics means something in this context, it means that I can sort of summarize a person's entire being simply by his relationship to some grievance that occurred before he was born, for the most part. And that, to me, is much more similar to what humanity believed in before the rise of the Enlightenment, right? Aristocracy has existed in every single society that has ever existed, in one form or another. At its core, it is the belief that certain people are better or more deserving than other people simply by virtue of an accident of birth. That's what identity politics says. I think the best version of America is the version of America that says you're supposed to take people as you find them, right? This narrative that starts with the Declaration, gets improved and built upon and made central by Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, and reaches something like its apotheosis with Martin Luther King saying that this country signed a promissory note when it issued the Declaration of Independence that we owe it to all people, including black people, to judge them by the contents of their character. That is the good American story. And these days, to say that that we should judge people by the contents of the character rather than the color of their skin elicits riots of rage in certain quarters of the left, and increasingly now certain quarters of the right. And I think that's sad and dangerous.
A couple of things about what you just said. One is there's a little bit of an irony. I mean, in a certain sense, I would think you'd want to emphasize the horrors of America's past and the horrors of the West past, because then you can argue that things have gotten a lot better, which is an argument you make. It's kind of like the Steve Pinker argument. I mean, his kind of, it's funny, his upbeat argument, which is sometimes criticized as kind of apologetics for capitalism or for imperialism, is in fact dependent on his acknowledging and even emphasizing a lot of the darkness in the American story and in the Western story. There's
Sure.
that. So that's kind of a dual use fact about our history.
As I said, I mean, you have to teach the bad stuff
Right,
too.
right.
I'm just saying that it can't is the only thing that we need to know about Christopher Columbus,
Right,
that he was a
right.
genocidal murderer? Is it?
But the other thing I'd say is so your book, it spends a certain amount of time on what you call the Western miracle, as associated in particular with the advent of the Enlightenment, the advent of kind of modern more or less capitalism and so on, and then sometimes you talk about the American miracle.
Right.
It is true that the essence of the miracle that you want to extol, the in a sense transcendence of tribalism, has been very late to actually arrive, right? I mean, initially only white male property holders could vote, and then that loosened up, then finally women, blacks, and so on.
Right.
But it's been actually, the miracle didn't arrive full blown until in my lifetime. I think blacks have been lynched in the South. So you take that point too, right? It
Sure.
in a certain sense is not a very long-lived miracle at this point.
Well, no, I think that's unfair. I think that the problem is that you're talking about the miracle as an ideal to move towards to, right? And I consider it that, to be sure, right? I look at it as, it's like Seymour Martin Lipset used to say, if you only know one country, you don't know any country, right? Mm-hmm. And you need to have some comparative baseline to understand what's going on. And so the remarkable thing about the miracle is this change in consciousness, this change in rhetoric, this change in the way that we view ourselves. And of course, it takes time to unfold. So in one sense, absolutely, it is better now for more people in 2018 than it was in 1918 or even 1958. I think that's indisputable, right? Mm-hmm. It's like there are a lot of conservatives and libertarians who say this isn't a free country anymore. And I've been having this argument with them for 15, 20 years. And I say, well, except for the women and the blacks, right? I mean, because this idea that like G. Gordon Liddy used to say, this used to be a free country. Well, for who? I think that is a perfectly legitimate point that the left brings up all the time and the right does not spend enough time on. That said, the standard by which to judge historical moments isn't against the abstract perfection of the realized ideal. It is in relation to what came before it. Mm-hmm. And by the slavery part, which is a huge part, notwithstanding, the idea that emerges out of the Glorious Revolution, which was of course imperfect, right? I mean, you have John Locke writing in his Notes on Toleration that we need to have religious tolerance. It's vital to have religious tolerance, but of course, not for Catholics.
Right.
And what happens is that idea comes over as a cultural norm, and then Jefferson basically puts it in the centrifuge and says not only should Catholics have freedom, but atheists and Hindus and pagans and whatever, everybody should have it. Barack Obama used to make this all a point all the time. He used to steal a page from Rawls and say, if you could be born in any moment in any place in the world, you didn't know if you're going to be black or white or gay or straight or whatever, you probably pick about now in the United States of America. And I think that's right. So you're right to say that the miracle's still unfolding and getting better for people who have been too slow to help. But the flip side of that is, where is the celebration of that fact? Where is the gratitude for the fact? Instead, it is this is proof that capitalism is evil. This is proof that Western style culture is evil and racist. And I go back to the Lipset point. Compared to who? China basically has Jim Crow today in terms of non-ethnic Han. And yet you still have people like Tom Friedman talking about extolling the Chinese model as superior. Point to a country that you want to emulate that is less racist than the United States of America, that does less well by people. I'm sure you can point to Holland or this or that, but as a general proposition, this miracle is a great and glorious thing, particularly for the people who, as representatives of a certain type in the new class, are the most likely to denounce it these days.